What's up, nerdlings? In this video, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things on earth, carbohydrates. So let's get started. So what comes to mind when you think of carbs or carbohydrates? More than likely, you're probably thinking about breads and pastas and sugary soft drinks and cupcakes and candy and donuts and muffins and biscuits, and now I really am really hungry. But what you probably aren't thinking about is cellulose. And this is a component of cell walls that helps give those cells their rigid structure, and it helps to maintain the composure of plants. So even if plants lose a lot of water, they wilt and they don't just flop on the floor like an animal cell would. You also might not be thinking about chitin, which is a structural component in the exoskeletons of insects. So if you've ever crunched a bug, like you smacked it with a shoe, or you hit it with your hand, or with a mosquito, you might have heard a slight crunch. That crunch that you're hearing is the exoskeleton, which is composed of chitin, which is a carbohydrate. So why do we actually need all of these carbohydrates? So many times in media and online and from our friends, we hear about the negatives of carbohydrates. We hear about the keto diet and the Atkins diet and going low carb and no carb and going into ketosis. But what we're really saying is that you have to have carbohydrates for energy. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to consume, 50 sodas a day to fuel your body. Now, we can have our carbohydrates coming from better sources with lower glycemic indexes versus drinking sugary sodas every day. But we have to have these carbohydrates in order to create ATP, which is the universal energy molecule. And if you take a deep breath and you blow out, that's carbon dioxide and water. So your body's undergoing the process of cellular respiration. And the whole goal of cellular respiration is to produce that guy, which is ATP. We get the energy from this molecule by cleaving off that last high energy phosphate bond. And that fuels our body. That's also why you might have heard a coach tell you, or you might be watching a movie about some type of sporting, event like conquering all, coming back, the underdogs, all of that. But you have inevitably at some point in time in your life heard of someone saying you need to carbo load to give yourself energy the night before a big game or a big race. You've probably also seen marathon runners or cyclists drinking Gatorades or squeezing those packets of goo. Those are chocked full of carbohydrates, and that fuels our body. Now, carbohydrates give us this really quick energy fix. So they are short-term energy for fueling our body. We have some cells that need more carbohydrates, that need more ATP in turn, which would be our muscle cells. So for running, we need to fuel all of those muscles in our legs. So carbohydrates are sugars, and the fancy schmancy science word for sugars is saccharide. So if we have a single sugar, meaning one, we call that a monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide refers to sugar. Now, another piece of information to keep in mind is that carbohydrates are typically in a 1:2:1 ratio. 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So 1:2:1. Now, when we get into lipids, they are also composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they're not in that 1:2:1 ratio. There we go. Got my fingers confused. So some examples of common carbohydrates or monosaccharides that you've probably all heard about are fructose, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the sugar that we find in fruit. So if I'm going to have a kiwi, which is one of my favorite fruits, the sugars found in the kiwi are fructose. We also have glucose and galactose. So this is just another way of depicting a monosaccharide. Typically, you're going to see monosaccharides given to you in the structural formula, which is going to be in the rings. Every once in a while, you'll see something like this where you actually have to count the carbons to look for that 1:2:1 ratio. So next up, disaccharides. Di means 2. So if we have 2 sugars linked together, we call that a disaccharide, keeping in mind that we still have that 1:2:1 ratio. So common disaccharides are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So this guy right here, the sugar found in milk, is actually what makes you lactose intolerant, meaning that you can't break down the sugar in milk. And we call those people lactase impersistent. So lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. So if you cannot break down lactose, you are called lactose intolerant, or lactase, meaning the enzyme, impersistent. But fear not, there are many different pills readily available called Lactaid that give you the enzyme that you need so you can consume all of the ice cream that you want. So how do we go from a monomer to a polymer? Well, if you've watched some of my earlier videos, we talked about a process that's called dehydration synthesis. So dehydrate means removing water, and synthesis means putting together. So we're going to remove water and put those monomers, or smaller polymers, together. So looking over here, we have one of these glucose molecules that's going to lose a hydroxyl group. The other one's going to lose a hydrogen. So when those combine, they form water as a byproduct, and it will link the two together. This is going to be a strong covalent bond. So the opposite of that is hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, and lysis, hacha, means to split. So it's the exact opposite of dehydration synthesis. We are adding water and splitting that apart. So we could be splitting apart a polysaccharide, or we could be splitting apart a disaccharide into single monomer sugars, or monosaccharides. So this would be an example of creating a disaccharide. So we're going to remove water, and it's going to link those two monomers together. And so just to provide you with a super quick recap, in case you haven't seen these before, handy dandy tangle beads, and to demonstrate hydrolysis, hydro meaning water, and lysis meaning hacha, to split. So you're going to add water, and we're going to pretend that each one of these is a monosaccharide, mono meaning one, and saccharide meaning sugar. So all of these guys linked together would be called a polysaccharide, because we have many of them. So if I wanted to split this apart, I'm going to use the process of hydrolysis. So adding water, and it's going to split apart. Now the opposite of that, if I wanted to link these together and form a larger polymer, or a larger polysaccharide, since we're talking about sugars, I'm going to use the process of dehydration synthesis. So dehydrate again means removing water, and synthesis means putting together. So to demo that, we're going to remove water, and we're going to link those together, forming a larger polysaccharide. So we talked about monosaccharides and disaccharides. Now we're going to talk about polysaccharides, which means many, many, many glucose molecules put together, or simple sugars put together. Again, we're going to maintain that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. So some of the most common, well-known polysaccharides are glycogen, which is how we store energy in our liver. We have cellulose, which composes the cell walls of plants. We also have chitin, which composes the cell walls of mushrooms or fungus. And then chitin also composes the exoskeletons of different types of insects. We also have a polysaccharide that's called starch, which should sound pretty familiar to you because we have starch in things like potatoes. And that's how plants store their sugars. They store them in the form of starch. Animals really store them in the form of glycogen. And when we need glycogen, our liver will release it, and then we can utilize it so we can form ATP. And whenever we have ATP, then we can break that high energy phosphate bond off of that last phosphate on there, and then we can utilize that energy in our cells to fuel our body and to allow us to do everything. Just like I'm talking with my hands right now, that is using ATP. So again, our examples are starch, which is found in plants, we have cellulose, which composes those cell walls of plants, and then we have glycogen, which is how animals store their glucose in liver cells. And so all of this put together, we need carbohydrates for energy. Now, again, like I said earlier, that doesn't mean you have to go drink a bunch of sodas and eat donuts all day long to fuel your body. Carbohydrates can come from healthy sources, such as plants. You can eat sweet potatoes. You can have whole grain wheat and pasta. Those have a lower glycemic index, so they're not going to make your blood sugar spike, which is what doctors are typically concerned about, is having those high blood glucose levels, because your body has too much glucose floating around to use it. So again, where does all the energy come from? So we need it to create ATP, but all that energy is going to be stored in the bonds of those glucose or sugar molecules themselves. So just to kind of give you a short review before this short little sweet video is over, pun intended, is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the main components of carbohydrates. They are in a 1:2:1 ratio, 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. The monomer is called monosaccharides. Mono meaning 1 and saccharide meaning sugar. Some common examples of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Polymers can include disaccharides, di meaning 2, so that would be 2 sugars. And examples of a disaccharide are sucrose and lactose, which is the sugar found in milk. We have oligosaccharides, which are basically this kind of midpoint between disaccharides and polysaccharides. Usually polysaccharides, we have thousands of glucose molecules together. And then if we're in like the hundreds, usually we're talking about oligosaccharides, but you do not need to know this for your course, whether you're in honors bio or AP bio. That's kind of out of the realm of your scope and sequence or the material that you need to know. So examples of polysaccharides are plants have starch, and they also have cellulose that composes their cell walls. In animals, we have glycogen. And then in animals such as insects, they have not cell walls, they have exoskeletons composed of chitin as well. So do some funguses. And then the main function of carbohydrates is short-term energy. We get that from our ATP. It also functions for some energy storage, so we can store that in our liver cells as glycogen. And then we do need it for our plasma membrane. We do have some carbohydrates that are kind of integrated into our plasma membrane. Not so much as plant cell walls. Plant cell walls need that for their structure. And then again, insects use that for their exoskeleton in the form of chitin, and so do fungus. So I hope this video was helpful, and hopefully this did not make you want to go to the store and grab a bunch of donuts like it did for me. I hope you guys all have a great day, and if you need any more educational, dorky biology videos, you can go to www.nerdlingscience.com. Queen Nerdling, signing off.